Pigweed here. Today we review an ale and discuss evolution. Hello and welcome to Beer and Conversation with Pigweed and Crowhill. Good evening, Crowhill.
Good evening, Pigweed.
What is on your mind?
Well, when I was in college,
Yes.
I was a geology student
Okay.
and also an evangelical.
Okay.
So I had
Could be some conflict.
there was some conflict going on there because my geology training was teaching me one thing, and my evangelical training was teaching me something else.
Whoa.
And it was something I struggled with a lot, trying to
I
figure
bet.
out, how do you thread the needle with these kind of thread the needle. Put in thread through it. Yeah. How do you make this work? So I spent a lot of time on that topic, and as with many things that I spent a lot of time with in my youth, I regret having wasted it. But, that's where it is. So yeah, talking about evolution is a somewhat of a fraught topic for me, but it's a good topic. I think it's something we ought to address because there are some things recently that have come up that.
Yes, you're right. We could have talked about this at any times. I felt like there was a few cracks in the armor that made me think that this was something that we should pursue. But let's pursue.
All right,
what we have before us.
What we have before us is my Tavern Ale, but a slightly imperial version of my Tavern Ale.
Yeah.
I took my 5-gallon Tavern Ale recipe and brought it down to 3 gallons, which makes everything stronger.
Yeah.
More malt, more hops. So it's a little jacked up, probably in the 7% range.
Right. So it would have been
a 5-er, and now it's more like 7%. And it's a relatively simple recipe. One time we went to the Rathskeller, and what's that brewery that they had associated with?
I think Old Dominion.
Old Dominion, yeah. They had a beer called a Tavern Ale, which I really liked, and I tried to make a homebrew version of it. So I made a regular homebrew version that was pretty much like that one, and it worked out pretty well. This is just the same thing, a little stronger.
A little bit more imperial.
And this is very, very young. This is we brewed this, a week and a half ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is maybe too early to drink this, but it's...
Right, you had it fermenting for about a week, and then you put it in
less
the
than a
hopper?
week. Yeah, I let it ferment from Saturday to about Thursday, and then I kegged it, and it's been sitting in the keg for about a week. So
yeah, it's kind of what you say. It is a nice malty ale, malt forward ale, and you can taste it's a little bit jacked.
yeah, just a little bit.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's extra malt flavors.
Yeah.
There's extra booziness.
If I was to do this again, I would probably add a little bit more aroma hops. Because I think that's maybe what's missing. But the color is decent. It's a little touch cloudy.
It is, but I think it just hasn't settled down.
Yeah,
it's just
exactly.
like you said.
Right.
It's very new. It hasn't been fully carbonated, and it's probably still fermenting for.
Yeah. So it's pretty good. Yeah. All right. So evolution. Why in the heck are we talking about
Well,
this?
we're talking. Well, let's back it up. Why does anybody ever talk about evolution?
Okay.
And it's basically because of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
Right? So there were people before him who had some ideas about natural selection and stuff like that, and didn't spring fully out of his head. But he was born in February 12th, 1809.
Yeah.
What does that tell you?
It's a long time ago.
What? Who shares his birthday? I don't mean his birthday. I mean his birthday and year.
And year. Oh, you got me.
Abraham Lincoln.
Wow. Okay.
there
Well, that
you
gives
go.
you some context.
So there you go. And died 1882. Now, in 1831, he embarked on he was what would you call a naturalist.
Yes.
At the time, his dad wanted him to be a doctor, but he was a little squeamish.
So apparently he studied to be a doctor. He also went into seminary for a while.
How do you know?
Yeah.
And so he started, is interested in studying the natural world, and a 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle.
Now, what I learned just recently,
Yeah.
a lot of people think that he was the official naturalist on the Beagle.
Yeah.
That's not true. He started off just being sort of a companion to the pilot, to the captain, because in previous voyages, captains had nobody to talk to, and the previous captain in one of these missions killed himself out of like boredom.
Loneliness.
So the new captain was like, I'm going to bring somebody to talk to.
Yeah.
And Darwin just went along sort of as this guy's companion.
Right.
And the guy who was supposed to be the official naturalist stayed with him for about part of the journey and then went back home. And then Darwin kind of took that role.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of just collecting things and observing things.
Right.
I mean, that's just what you do as a naturalist.
Yeah.
And he led him to formulate his theories. In 1859, he published his landmark book on the origin of species.
Right.
So just to get some dates, right? So we're talking 1859.
Yeah. And realized that in that time period, they didn't know anything about DNA.
Yeah.
Gregor Mendel, his experiments with the peas and all that kind of stuff, was around the same time as Darwin, but Darwin wasn't aware of it, so he didn't know about any of that.
But I mean, just passing on genes.
Well, Gregor Mendel's experiments would show how traits would be passed on from generation to generation, and gave some indication about how you'd have dominant and recessive characteristics and that sort of stuff. But apparently Darwin knew nothing of it when he wrote Origin of Species. So they didn't know anything about that, and they thought of the cell as just this like goo. You know, they didn't realize they didn't have the
containing information.
Yeah, they didn't have the microscopes to be able to see what's actually going on in a cell. So they just kind of thought of it as this goo. So there were a lot of things in Darwin's day that they did not understand that modern biology has opened up and explained much better.
Which actually makes the theories a little bit more impressive.
Yes.
Right? That he's really operating with just a lot of conjecture and pretty solid stuff.
Yes, and yes, it is a remarkable advance and an amazing theory, although you could also say that to some extent the idea of natural selection is almost a tautology. It's like the thing that survives. You know, survival of the fittest basically means, because there's no definition of fittest other than the thing that actually survives.
Yes.
Right?
But fit doesn't mean strongest and fastest and most deadly. It is most adaptable to its environment.
Exactly.
So you want to talk about the finch beaks?
Yeah, so that's a good illustration. That's one of the big things that Darwin is famous for, is he realized that on different areas, you have some population of birds that come into an island.
There's been a lot of time in the Galapagos Islands off of South America.
Right. So in different environments, different beak shapes were more conducive to getting whatever they were going after.
Right. So clearly the same bird.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Just going, and so just extrapolating backwards going, all right, there must have been the same bird with the same beak at some point, and now, due to the variation of vegetation on various islands, they all have different beaks.
They specialized into different environments, right? So in one environment, it's better to have a longer beak, and in one environment, it's better to have a stronger beak.
You've got hard nuts that need to be cracked over here, and you have succulent flowers that need, so all of this is making perfectly good sense.
It's at the same time a brilliant insight and somewhat obvious.
Yeah, right?
You know, it is. Because, of course, the thing that survives to pass on its genes better than the other thing is going to dominate the population, right? I mean, that's relatively obvious. But it was an insight that hadn't been brought forward into the popular imagination, into the scientific world until Darwin. Yeah.
All right, before we move on with the specifics of this mutation,
right?
What were people thinking about at the time before that? Right?
Well, there were a lot of people So Darwin learned from Lowell. Who was the geologist that he learned? He was a student. He originally a geology student, and he was learning from one of the early geologists about. At this time, they were still trying to figure out Earth history and trying to understand how old the Earth was and how you would understand different rock formations and all this other kind of stuff. So Lyell, is that it? I should know this. I was a geology student, for heaven's sakes. But Darwin studied under this guy and learned a lot of things about what would have been called gradualism. That many processes, the same processes that we see going on today, rain and erosion and deposition of sediments and other kinds of things, that those processes over long periods of time would explain what we see in the natural world.
So the idea of a very, very, very old Earth,
yes,
was
percolating.
Pretty solid. These people.
It was at least one of the ideas that people were thinking about. That because before then, of course, people would just think. They would believe
people had already dug up dinosaur bones,
yes.
right? So they were aware of these.
Yes, they'd already found strange things. So they were aware that something else was going on. But they could have explained that as, these were creatures that were killed in the flood or something like that.
Yeah.
So up until that time, there was a strong bias towards something like a I don't want to say a biblical chronology because that begs the question of what's the correct way to read Genesis. Yeah. But if you take a literal reading of Genesis and you think the earth is only 6,000 years old or something like that, that was the general assumption up until people started trying to figure out what the heck is going on with geology. Why when you go out to this place, do you see thousands of layers of different kinds of rocks? What the heck is going on? What's the purpose of that? How did that happen? And once they started investigating that, they started realizing, no, we really can't explain this in 6,000 years with one big flood.
Right. So because what did that guy say? He says, the main character in all of this is time. Mm. So in order for Darwin's evolution to work, mm-hmm. is fundamental.
You had to have a lot of time.
Lots of time.
Yes.
So
and that's
those
going to come up
things
again.
have to work together. Mm-hmm. So let's just knock out these. What's the difference between creationism and young Earth creationism?
So creationism would just generally say that God is responsible for creating the world and life, but not necessarily putting a time frame on it. There were people who would try to reconcile evolution and Genesis. They would say that the days of Genesis could be ages or something like that.
Right.
There are various ways to try to say, yeah, fine, all this stuff happened over a longer period of time than we originally thought, but it was still God who made this stuff happen. Young Earth creationism says, no, wait a minute, we actually believe that days are days, and it only happened a few thousand years ago.
Yeah, but the idea of God creating a parent age.
Yes. That's another weird thing because from one perspective, philosophically, you could argue that the past doesn't even exist. That we were created 5 seconds ago.
5 seconds ago.
With memories of the past.
Yes.
With those things in our...
everything that we ever learned about is built into this thing that was actually just created 5 seconds ago.
Yes, and then there's no way to disprove that. You can't possibly disprove that. So it is, but that also makes God into a deceiver in a way. So that's not very appealing for that reason.
Yeah, good.
So young Earth creationism is the idea that mostly the flood accounts for all the geological things that we see. That when you see these layers of sediment and all this other kind of stuff, the main explanation for all that is the flood.
So the Grand Canyon was created by the flood.
Yeah.
And all of that. Okay. Then
now here's the flood. Since you raised the Grand Canyon, I just have to mention something.
Okay.
Trying to explain carving out the Grand Canyon by a flood, that's actually not crazy. Okay, if you wanted to say that some catastrophic event carved the Grand Canyon, okay, fine.
Because the weak sediment would just flow right through, and the firm stuff would hang on.
Well, it's just that when you have water is incredibly powerful.
Yeah,
and when you have huge amounts of water flowing,
bringing huge rocks,
ripping
through.
It can dig a tunnel, or a carve something out. It's amazing what water can do. But okay, let's say we even believe that. Let's say that the flood carved the Grand Canyon. What we're still left with was, okay, well, where did all those rock layers get to before the flood?
Yeah.
Right? So it's those kinds of questions that led the early geologists to say, look, we just really can't explain it in that context. We can't explain what we're seeing in the world and the age of the Earth with those assumptions.
Okay. Well, we can do. All right. So let's talk about the mechanism of evolution and maybe some of the intelligent design arguments.
Yeah.
And then before we get to whatever the big argument is. But,
So I think the big argument is the mechanism of evolution, because there are certain things that.
Oh, don't you? Do you have a nice tight definition of
what evolution is?
Yeah.
Sure. Descent with modification. I mean, that's the most basic description of what evolution is.
But I think the randomness.
Yeah, that's where it gets difficult.
Is where it gets sticky.
Yeah. So let's talk about.
That there are random mutations. I got no problem with the idea of random mutations. People,
Weird things happen.
Weird things happen. A bird has got 3 wings.
Right.
But it seems like most of these random mutations
are bad. Yes. Yeah. So
how
about if we
massively? All right.
How about if I just go through
ease into it.
Things that we know, things that unless you're guided by something other than looking at the evidence. Like for example, there are a lot of people who say, no, I start with the Bible. Right? That's my foundation. I start with the Bible. Okay. If you're that person, then this isn't going to make sense to you. Okay, I get it. But
there's some things that we can all pretty much get behind.
Yes. So one of the things we can all get behind is the Earth is very old.
Okay.
Okay. And that's very, very well established. And I'm sorry.
We keep backing it up. What are we up to now? 13?
4.5 billion years old for the Earth. The universe is like 13 billion years old. But so, I know the arguments for a young Earth, but I'm sorry, they just don't work. The Earth is very, very old.
How about first life?
Yeah.
You know where that is?
Yeah. So the
earliest fossils that we have.
So the first fossils are like in 600 million years ago. So you have this enormous stretch of time.
Okay, so out of the billions, you've got billions and billions plus some millions.
You've got like
before you even get to.
You've got almost 4 billion years of Earth history before you get to life, and there's some indeterminate amount of time where you have life that didn't leave any record. The pre-Cambrian, where you have all this. Maybe there was single cell or slimes and other kinds of things.
Yeah,
but
those things aren't going to leave.
Exactly, you're not going to get fossils. Right? Actually, you do get some fossils of like networks of slimy, moldy stuff. But generally speaking, you don't get.
But they can still suppose them to have existed.
Yeah, so there was a long period of time. Who knows how long, maybe a billion years, nobody knows, where there was life that didn't really leave any trace. And then you have what's called the Cambrian explosion, where all of a sudden you start getting all these fossils of complex organisms. So there was a long period of time before that where there was life, but it was like molds and bacteria and slime and, single-cell junk. So another thing that we know is that most creatures that have lived on this planet have gone extinct.
Right.
Another thing we know for sure is that creatures have changed over time. Now, some of these things we can observe now, like Darwin's finches would be an example where it's pretty obvious.
Moths move into a new environment and
And then in the fossil record, there are certain things, like, for example, the evolution of a horse, which is, you see very clear examples of changing from this kind of a creature.
There's little claws turn into hooves.
Yeah, relatively clear over time. This kind of a creature turned into this other kind of creature.
But within what you would call the same species.
Well, the species becomes a difficult question.
I know.
When you're talking about fossils, because one.
Well, definitely... I mean, like the grandparents of the horse I mean, are you going to trace it back to a fish?
Well, eventually, yeah. But what I'm talking about is there are gaps, obviously, in the fossil record. We don't have a continuous record where we can see fish changing little by little by little by little into this other thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's the argument. That's the problem.
Yes.
Go ahead and give
Okay.
us the rest of
So then another thing,
the solid stuff.
the other solid thing is that there's a lot of things about biology that evolution seems to explain decently well. For example, vestigial organs like the human tailbone,
All right.
and other things about similarities between animals and why humans have.
This is something that might have been advantageous for this species that was no longer advantageous, and it's got the
like
leftovers.
Why, for example, do we eat and breathe through the same tube? You know,
I mean, we ought to be breathing out of the top of our heads. I don't know how that worked.
Right.
Bad design.
So there are a lot of things that we know, and these things really shouldn't be argued. They're really pretty clear. But then there are other things that there's reasonable debate over, and that's where we get into stuff like whether the engine that powers evolution is simply random mutation. And that's where you lose me, honestly. Because I've never come to terms with that.
So, like you said, any mutations that we ever experience are never good. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the last 1,000 years, there must have been at least 10 billion people. Have any of them got fully formed gills and can breathe underwater?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the mutation is like a guy who's twice as fast as everybody else. Like a fully formed X-Man style mutation that is fully advantageous. Yeah. Now I realize the main character in this is time with millions of years. Sure.
It just doesn't make sense to me. Just from the basic concept of information theory. If you were to take a book. Take Harry Potter, okay, and make random changes to it. What are the odds you're going to improve it by making random changes to the book? It's just absurd to me.
So the 1,000 monkeys typing for 1,000,000 years.
Right. Writing Shakespeare.
So that's the same Macbeth is 5,000 pages, 5,000 words long.
5,000 words,
okay? And all these monkeys are typing out 5,000 at a time. Mm-hmm. If each time they got the right word in the right place, you highlighted it, got rid of everything else, and gave it back and started over. You know what?
That might work.
That might work with enough millions of years.
Yeah.
But if you just throw it away and start over again?
Yeah. This is one of the classic arguments, is when people try to say that, with enough time, anything is possible.
With enough time.
Okay, well, that's true. With enough time, anything is possible. If you have infinite time, then a monkey at a typewriter might actually type out Shakespeare. Okay, that's true. But the fact is, we don't have infinite time.
Right.
So when people have actually
just
tried
lots
to figure
and lots,
yes,
which is not infinite.
Exactly, we have lots and lots, but not infinite. And when people sit down and actually figure out the odds of 1,000 monkeys at 1,000 typewriters typing for 1,000 years, there's no chance that they would even. There's zero chance that they would even write the sentence, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So the idea that they would write Shakespeare is it's absolutely absurd.
And so that's what you're relying on, I think.
Yeah. So that's the thing to me, is the idea that there are changes that natural selection operates upon so that things adjust to their environment and the better suited things survive and pass on their genes. To me, that is so clearly established and obvious. There's just no point in arguing with that. But the idea of what's the engine that drives the change, that's the part where
how about like purely unguided, undirected mechanism that is producing the appearance of design in all these different forms of life, but it's not actual design because, of course, the mechanism that produced it is not guided by any intelligent agent.
That is the standard modern consensus. And personally, I just don't buy it. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. Because there isn't enough time. Random mutation doesn't do that. And aside from just my instinct about it, and there's been so much discovery in the last couple decades about the way genomes actually change. That randomness doesn't need to be the engine anymore. There are all these new things that they've discovered about gene transfer and other kinds of things that have nothing to do with randomness.
And I think it's meeting a middle ground between the intelligent designer and the randomness argument.
Yes.
Right? It's like, I'm not saying that we've got, a designer. I'm just saying that that this Darwinian randomness is not cutting it.
Exactly. So I'm not trying
perfectly legitimate, perfectly guys who don't work for the Discovery Institute are seeing the problem.
Yes, exactly. So you don't have to say that God intervened. All you have to say is, I'm sorry, randomness is not a sufficient explanation. And I think, to me, that is just ridiculously obvious.
Yeah.
And a lot of scientists nowadays are realizing that, and they're looking at other mechanisms. There was an article that we both looked at by somebody named Shapiro.
Yeah.
And he was saying that there are all these different mechanisms by which creatures change their genome. It's not random mutation. That there are other kinds of gene replacements and things where things go cross species and all kinds of crazy stuff that's way beyond my understanding of biology.
So say it's clearly an advantage for the giraffe to get a longer neck.
Right.
So you're saying there's another mechanism in the advantageousness of having a longer neck that you could somehow express a gene that would pass on to your offspring without just you randomly having a longer neck.
Yes. So the problem, the caricature of evolution is, okay, if random mutation is doing all this cool stuff, then what we should expect to see, we should look around and expect to see, this guy's got 3 eyes. This guy's got 12 fingers. This guy's got 4 ears.
Guy breathing out the top of the head like I want to be.
Exactly. So if randomness was going to be that's what we would expect. And we don't see that. And the numbers just don't add up for that. So there's some other thing going on. And I don't know the biology well enough to say what these other things are, but I know that people who are not, they're not creationists, they're not in the Discovery Institute, they're not intelligent design people, are saying, I'm sorry, there are other mechanisms for the way the genome changes that has nothing to do with randomness.
Well, the neo-Darwinists are going, just because this is God of the gaps talk here. Just because we haven't figured out how that mechanism works doesn't mean that you can just poo-poo it. Just give us some more time. And then the intelligent design people are, you've had enough time, and then the non-Darwinians, the post-Darwinians or whatever, are going, there could be other things going on here than just pure randomness.
The thing that bugs me about all this is the modern consensus about evolution assumes that there's no plan, no purpose. And it's almost like a religious commitment to no plan, no purpose, everything is random.
Religious commitment to non-religion?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So all of their attempts to say, they resist anything that abandons the idea of just plain randomness and chance. And I don't quite understand that. It seems to be a philosophical commitment rather than a scientific commitment.
Yeah, it's funny that it sounds to me somewhat anti-science, and yet these are the people who use the term anti-science against their opponents.
Yes.
It's like, well, if you're not on board with this, you're anti-science, while not considering everything sounds like that's what's anti-science.
Yes. Yeah, so what they ought to do is have an open mind about, well, we don't understand how we solve all these philosophical problems. We're just going to look at the facts, and we're going to see that genome changes over time are not random. The random stuff is almost exclusively bad.
Right.
Maybe every once in a while there's a random thing that works out well.
Okay,
fine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a kid is born without a limb or without eyes with his stomach on the outside of his body. I mean, how often is it a positive?
It's almost never.
Yeah.
Very close to almost never. And there are other explanations for how we get the changes, because remember that evolution is the simple definition of evolution is descent with modification. So the question is, where does the modification come from? And there are biological explanations for where the modification comes from that do not invoke randomness. There's other things going on.
Yeah.
Now,
directed mutation or something like that, right? Like,
well, so there you do have the question. There are all kinds of spooky questions to ask, like if some creature. Let's go back to Lamarckianism. One of the early disputes in evolutionary theory was whether change over time was exclusively random or whether things that a creature learned in its lifetime would be passed on to its kids.
Exactly right. So the opposite would be if you, all right, look, we chopped off the tails of all of these rats over and over and over, generation after generation.
And they learned not to have tails.
Right, but that never happened, right?
Right.
The tails kept, so they're going, all right, so what happens during the lifetime of an adult can't be passed on because it's in the genes, and that's immutable.
Yes.
But there's a little something else going on.
There's a little something else, which seems to be that if the environment is calling for a certain kind of a change,
yes,
that somehow or other the organism is able to make changes to the genome that adapt to that environment.
So I read this study, a Swedish study about chickens, and these chickens were very good at, finding the food in a maze, let's say. But they were isolated long enough that they lost that skill, and then their offspring also lost that skill.
Okay.
And so that's a case of them going, wait a minute, this is an event that took place in their lifetime, and it's not like having your tail chopped off. They were able to pass on this negative attribute, it turns out. And so what's going on there?
Right. Yeah. So I don't pretend to understand all the ins and outs of all this stuff.
But it is going on in a scientific
non-religious,
non-creationist way.
Yeah, exactly, non-creationist. So another part of this whole debate is the question of teleology or purpose, which you go back to Aristotelianism and the causes, the formal cause and the efficient cause and all this other kind of stuff.
Yes,
one of the things that's missing in evolution is the concept of a teleology or an end. So that is something that is a philosophical problem, but it's not a scientific problem.
Right.
The scientific problem is, let's figure out what's actually happening and how do genomes change over time, and forget trying to impose a philosophy on it. Let's not impose creationism on it. Let's not impose randomness on it. Let's not impose a philosophical worldview on evolution. Let's just
do science.
Let's just do science and let the science be the science, and let the philosophers deal with all the other kind of questions.
Right. You mind if I go back a couple hundred years, just?
What, when I was born?
So I'm gonna. I don't want to lean in too much towards the pro-intelligent design crowd, but they've got something to say.
They do.
So the scientific revolution was from God-believing men.
Mostly, yes.
They weren't. They weren't trying to remove God from the equation.
Right.
And before it was called science, it was called natural philosophy.
Yes.
And it meant the right way to think about the observations in nature is what was pre-science before we called it science.
Well, and science developed in the West precisely because we had an underlying philosophy that believed that the world was understandable.
Yes.
And that the human mind was capable of understanding what's going on in the world. That's where science evolved.
There was a religious aspect to understanding God's the way that God made the world.
Yes.
And that God made it understandable.
Yes.
For us.
Because otherwise there's no particular reason to believe that. There's no particular reason to believe that our brains that came about randomly are capable of understanding reality. There's no real reason to believe that at all.
Yeah, right. Or which is, I guess we get back to consciousness and being, the idea that the brain can perceive God. Well, it would be because God built that into man's mind.
Right.
So there was no conflict that we're talking about now about, evolution versus creationism. That wasn't going on. These were largely religious men.
Yes.
So I had this observation before, but I'd never put it in this context until I was looking into this. That imagine the adult in the 1850s,
right,
and the adult in the 1920s.
Okay.
I mean, we're like one generation, really.
Right.
You have now experienced Marx, Freud, and Darwin.
Yes.
The worldview of these
radically
two men
changed. Yeah.
So it was radically, and I always just found that an interesting observation.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize how atheistic.
Yes.
These three things did.
Yes.
It took away the explanation of the origin of man, the Freud's how do you deal with the complications of the human condition,
right,
and Marx's what is the future of a perfected man,
right.
All of that is sucked out of religion.
Yes.
In this very small time frame.
Yes.
And I think science has become, hostile to religion ever since.
But it's not just so what you're saying about the confluence of all these things coming together, Darwin, Marx, Freud, all that stuff coming together at the same time, was an enormous jolt to the collective consciousness of humanity.
Yeah,
absolutely no question
how we
about
understand our place in the world, etc.
Yes, and in a way, science and the kind of Enlightenment project, the Enlightenment project plus science plus all this doubt has created a completely different mindset about where humans exist in the universe and what our role is and all that other kind of
Exactly, because Enlightenment and the scientific revolution did not have the intention of kicking God out of the equation.
No.
But then that's where it ended up.
Yes. Once you add these other elements, that's what happened. So now science has become religion in a way, in a funny way. And
then any effort to insert religion or suppose a role for religion is anti-science. And I think that's, what the Disco Institute is trying to say, it's not really science. If you're considering, when you look at all of everything that tells you that thing has been designed, and you to say we have to kick that idea out in favor of everything just looks like it's being designed. Is maybe, aren't you the one that's anti-science?
Yeah. See,
I don't want to get too bad. I don't want to defend these guys too much.
No.
But I don't know.
I think there should be all kinds of theories. You should allow people to say, okay, maybe there's some sort of collective consciousness of all living things, or who knows what. I mean, I don't care. It doesn't matter what your crazy theory is. The question is, can you demonstrate it scientifically?
Yeah.
So there should be two different approaches going on at the same time. Right. One is the philosophical, religious, conceptual, let's look at the big picture question. And then there's the other of what's the mechanism and how does it work and how do we reduce this down to chemistry and everything else.
You know, when we talked about are we living in a simulation?
Yeah.
The idea that there are, why can't anything go faster than the speed of light? Why does it look like there are rules? Why does everything that's got a code to it, like zeros and ones in computers or an alphabet or anything like that, has a designer behind it? And why have we've decided that this AGT, what am I missing? C genetic code.
Right.
I mean, it looks like something that's been designed.
Yeah, it does. And so
Right.
so a lot of scientists will say that's the trick of evolution, is that we have all these things that look like they're designed,
Yeah.
but they're actually not. And okay, fine. That's your position, fine. But can't somebody else have another position? So my you ready to kind of wrap this up?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So my basic position on all this is, look, the Earth is old, get over it.
Right.
Sorry, that's just a fact. That creatures have clearly changed over time. That's just a fact. That evolution in terms of descent with modification, that's clearly a fact. All those things, it's just dumb to deny those things. I'm sorry. However, the idea that the engine that drives all of that is random mutation has never set right with me, and I simply don't believe it. There's got to be some better explanation. I'm not saying it's God. I don't know what it is.
Right.
I'm just saying that the idea that you're going to explain all this with randomness, sorry, it doesn't wash.
But you're okay with going backwards to that. Does the Genome Project say that we have a significant amount of genetic similarity to a banana? I mean, kind of, a little bit.
Yeah, yes. And so there is...
I mean, so in terms of taking it back to the tree of life that actually comes back to a single thing.
Well, there is some dispute of whether it's a single thing or maybe a few things. But anyway, the tree of life certainly goes back to one or a few original progenitors. And the fact that we share so much in common with a banana is evidence of that. It's such a weird thing. Like, you share 50% of your DNA with a banana. What are you talking about? It's kind of crazy. But that's the way it is, because the reality is that all of life seems to have developed this way.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty solid. I'm just thinking that, if there are a few people noticing a few cracks, and I think we should explore those cracks. And
without bias, let's let the intelligent design people make their arguments, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
I'm not asserting that there is intelligent design, but they're observing things that need to be explained. And what's wrong with that? That's what science is all about, finding problems. I do have one thing that I wanted to... Are we done with this?
Yes, we're done.
Okay. So I did have one thing that I wanted to bring up as kind of a man of the week.
Okay.
Not quite a man of the week, but maybe a country of the week?
All right. Well, is El Salvador?
No, China.
I don't even know you. I can't... It was not 1 week ago that we talked about how China is undermining America. We did the Silk Road. We did Cultural Revolution. We have never had one nice thing to say about China. And here China has become man of the week.
Yes. And here's the reason.
Okay.
They've converted a mosque into a dance hall.
Thank you. God, I mean, there's got to be some good ideas.
There's got to be something reasonable that they do. So in China, they don't like any religions.
Yeah.
But they particularly apparently don't like Islam.
Yeah.
And they think of it as a mental illness, which you got to give them some credit for that. Yeah. So apparently they found this beautiful building that had been created by the Muslims.
Yeah, they could because they could have just torn the whole thing down.
Yeah, but why do that?
Wait a minute, it's
a nice building. It's a lovely building. So let's do something with it. So they converted it into a dance hall.
Well, how nice is that?
It's lovely. I wish. I'm sorry, this is gonna be a fat one against me. I wish every mosque was converted into a dance hall.
Lovely dance hall.
That would be a nice thing. It would be a nice thing if that were to happen.
Yes, it would. Yes, and from the behavior that I've seen everywhere, from screaming Muslims in the Middle East to the campuses of the United States,
yes,
it looks like a mental illness.
It does.
And the kind of countries it produces, the kind of relationships between people that it produces, I see
nothing positive.
I see nothing positive.
There are obviously good things in Islam. There are Muslims in principle.
Yes.
And there are clearly Muslims who are good people, who believe in peace, who are gentle, kind, good people, charitable people. All those things, absolutely true. I've met some of these people. very good, fine people. You couldn't ask for a better neighbor. Very, very good people. But the question is, Islam itself, does it promote the kind of a culture and the kind of a world that we want? And I think the answer is clearly no.
You just look throughout Europe. Has Europe benefited from its suicidal mass importation of Muslims who come in and just straight from the get-go say, we need to change this.
Yeah.
We need to throw the Parliament into the Thames, and this
impose
place needs
Sharia
to be,
law and everything else.
You know, I'm sure that these are the loudmouth troublemakers, and not your everyday Muslim. But what I'm saying is, I don't blame China one little bit.
No, for this particular thing.
Yeah,
so, China, you're wrong about 99 other things.
but I think you got this right.
Yeah, that's good.
Dance hall.
Thanks so much for listening to Beer and Conversation with Pigweed and Crowhill. Remember to visit us at pigweedandcrowhill.com or send us an email at pigweedshow@gmail.com.